Brian works on jobs and the economy, and Garrett's been leading it when it comes to energy and the environment. What I thought I'd do today, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about their task force, asking them a few questions about that, then we'd open it up, talk about more as we go. And Jim, you have so many different topics that you've been working on, but within your task forces, really you go out to the American public, and we see it day in and day out, the number of freedoms that people have been losing, but the fear of what they can lose in the future as well. If you give us a little update on where it's going, what people have fear from.
Yeah, I mean, I hear about it from constituents all the time, or as we travel, we hear about it from Americans across the country. You think about it, I maybe said this the other day, but every single right we enjoy under the First Amendment has been assaulted over the last year. Until a few months ago, there were still some locations in the country where a full congregation couldn't meet on a Sunday morning. Your right to assemble, I always use the example, about a year ago I spoke to the New Mexico Republican Party in Amarillo, Texas, because they had to go to Texas to get the freedom to assemble because their Democrat governor wouldn't let them get together in their own darn state. And you can just go down the list. I still remember the moment when Jen Psaki stood at the White House. Think about your freedom of the press. You all should care about. We all should care about. Jen Psaki standing at the lectern in the White House press briefing room, and she is the press spokesperson for the President of the United States in the White House, considered the center of freedom. And she basically said this. She said, most Americans now get their news from social media platforms. We, the Biden administration, are working with these social media platforms to limit the information Americans get to see. And I'm like, wait, something doesn't seem right about this. You got the press person in the White House, in the press room, making those kind of statements. And then on it goes. And the one we care, I think, most about is your right to speak, because I tell folks all the time, if you can't talk, what do the rest of your rights mean? I mean, can you really practice your faith? And so this is the concern Americans have, and whether it's big tech, whether it's the cancel culture mob coming after people who don't speak what the woke mob thinks is appropriate, this is very scary. And so you add to that concerns about other liberties, you add to that this debate where some say government knows what's best for kids versus moms and dads directing the upbringing of their children's education, something that the leader's working with Julia Letlow and some other things. So that's sort of the broad spectrum. How it translates into legislation, we're not exactly sure yet. Certainly there'll be something that we're working with Kathy on I think on big tech. I know Kevin and Kathy talked about that yesterday. But it's mostly just highlighting the concerns there and making sure, and I'll finish here, the committee that I get to serve on, we are supposed to be the committee in Congress most concerned about protecting the American people's liberty, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, rule of law. And we have to get back and stay focused on that. So that's what the task force is about, and how it relates to judiciary. That's sort of where we're trying to go with it.
Well, you serve on judiciary today as a ranking member. If we're fortunate enough to take the majority, you'll become chair. You've been working with Kathy. You got both jurisdiction when it comes to big tech. You've been spending some time at this. You've got a number of bills that the Democrats tried to bring through, but it seemed like they wanted to make big tech utilities instead of protecting freedoms and others. You want to touch a little on some of the ideas that we can move through with big tech, hopefully in the next Congress?
I think first and foremost is an complete overhaul, change of Section 230, the liability protection that big tech platforms now enjoy. That has to change. If you're going to make editorial decisions, that has to change. You talked about this yesterday, Leader. I think it's right on target. We do think that it's important to get any antitrust actions in an expedited fashion in front of the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas has talked about he wants to deal with this issue. I think the court is looking to. So let's expedite how these cases move through our federal court system. Hopefully, get them to the court in an expedited way. Those are some of the things we're looking at, and then hopefully you have increased competition. So it's not just a handful of these platforms with all the power, but there's real competition there. The one thing I'm concerned about is empowering the agencies, because I think, frankly, we see this, I think, in other agencies, but certainly I'm concerned about at the FTC, the leadership there working with big tech to further restrict and censor conservative thought and conservative speech. So we're very nervous about that, and that's where, unfortunately, I think the Democrat legislation, bills sponsored by Mr. Cicilline and others, where those bills would take us. So I think that's the wrong approach. The right approach is competition. The right approach is taking away the liability protection. The right approach is hopefully getting antitrust actions in front of the Supreme Court in a much quicker fashion.
Right out. You know, the concern too, it's not just going after conservative speech. Now they want to go after conservative money. Like we watch with the truckers and the GoFundMe. Now they want to pick and choose what people can give to. I mean, so it's just the power that they have throughout to be able to control so many. So I know this is one thing that we're going to be looking a great deal on. Brian, let me touch you. You work on jobs and the economy. And if there's one thing I would say the number one on Americans' minds is the rising cost of everything. Every food item, your rent, anything you do, your dollar goes not as far. And we've watched study after study from Wharton's that it's costing you $3,500 more, that we've watched with this one-party rule, not just from gasoline, but this one-party rule. Their policies have created this damage in so many ways. So your committee is looking at a lot of how do you control inflation, whereas we have not seen inflation like this in 40 years. 60% of those who are in the workforce have never seen inflation above 4%, and just last month, 7.9. So what are some of the challenges you guys see?
Yeah, Americans can't afford Democratic one-party rule, and people are getting clobbered every single day. When I go home, when all the members here go home, we hear time and again how people are taking it on the chin, whether or not they're at the gas pump, whether or not they're at the grocery store buying food, whether or not they're buying a new or a used car. They're seeing those prices going up, and the biggest difference here from pre-pandemic to today is wages aren't keeping up with inflation. So if we look back to pre-pandemic, after the tax reforms that Republicans in the House put forward, we saw real wage growth across the spectrum. Across the spectrum, women, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, veterans. We saw wage growth north of 6%. Now we're seeing real wage growth actually decreasing, where wages aren't keeping up with inflation. And so inflation impacts everybody. Who does it hurt the most? It hurts seniors on fixed incomes and low-income workers, in particular those who are renting. We're seeing rent costs go up, and on top of that, it's coupled with gas, with food, with other life essentials. What can we do to turn the corner on this? One, we can return to sound money policies. We've seen the Federal Reserve bulk up their balance sheet, put money into the system. We've seen runaway fiscal spending by the Democrats, and continuing to see that is being put forward as solutions to what is actually going to exacerbate the problem. When you dig into Build Back Better, policy after policy taxes job creators, puts in place policies that discourage companies from producing products here in the United States, rather than Republican policies to say we need to build things here in the United States to secure our supply chain. We have opportunities there. And in particular, we still have over 1 million workers who've left the workforce from before the pandemic to today, completely left the workforce. In addition to that, we have millions of Americans who are looking for work. Yet we have over 11 million jobs that are available. And so we have a need to connect workers to the jobs of the future, to make sure that they have the skill and preparation for those jobs. And in particular, as we look at the Parents' Bill of Rights with Julia Letlo's leading, we need to make sure moms and dads have the ability to make sure that their schools are preparing their sons and daughters for those jobs.
You know, what's interesting, it wasn't just Republicans who warned the Democrats, if they did with this runaway spending, that they would create inflation. Larry Summers told them. I mean, you couldn't get somebody closer in the Democratic Party from being in the Clinton administration, being the Secretary, Treasury. I mean, he literally, I know what he probably said behind the scenes, but because of how strong he was out front, but they just kept going forward. And even today, now you get the reporting. At first they would say it's transitory. Then they would blame the pandemic. Now they're blaming Putin. I mean, there's a different story. Now they're admitting, even the Fed chair is admitting this isn't going away. And the only way you get out of inflation, it almost seems like it's painful. But Pelosi thinks it's good for the deficit. It's good for everything else. I mean, I just can't believe this. And what are some of the actions that we can take right away outside of the sound fiscal policy and others? Do you look to the next Congress?
Absolutely. The Democrats continue to put forward plans to spend their way out of the problem. Spending your way is only going to make yourself further behind the 8 ball. We need to grow ourselves out of the challenge that the Democrats have put us in. to grow ourselves out of this, we have to put forward tax policies like we've seen before, encouraging production here in the United States. We have to re-examine our education system to make sure that we're tying the preparation for the jobs of the future. We've seen this disconnect, and it's continued to grow. We got to empower moms and dads to make sure that their children are receiving the education that they need to be able to join the workforce of the future. We need to continue to work to really secure the American supply chain. And to do that, we need to put forward policies that are encouraging our job creators to produce products here in the United States rather than taxing our job creators and encouraging those job creators to go abroad to produce their products.
Excellent. Garrett, I want to ask you, yours is energy and environment. And I will tell from all of you, he's probably one of the brightest individuals on these two subjects. From an ability of the knowledge of what's going on and not. And what's interesting to me, I was listening to the conference chair on the Democratic side, and he just said the other day, nobody in the Democratic conference has brought up one time the price of gasoline. And it doesn't matter who you are. As I travel the country, I just meet somebody for the first time, they bring up the price of gasoline. Why are we in this position that we are about energy 1 year after they took power? What is the backdrop to this? Because that is also a big driver of inflation.
It's a huge driver, and it does affect everyone. And as was noted earlier, I mean, this has a bigger impact on senior citizens and other folks that are on fixed income. One of the most perversive things, doesn't matter if you're a high school student, or if you're a retiree, or anyone in between, you have to drive. So first, Kevin, to answer the question, this administration, when Biden was a candidate, he was out there talking about how we are going to ban fossil fuels. He flat out said it. The current Secretary of Interior that's responsible for producing energy in the United States came out and said she is absolutely opposed to fracking and production of energy on public lands. Look, to overly simplify what we're experiencing right now, it'd be like if you had a garden in your backyard and you grew tomatoes and cucumbers in your own yard. But you said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and go buy it from Jim and Jane who live in the next town over. I'm going to buy their tomatoes and cucumbers, only to find out later that they're using the proceeds from that to go commit arson and burn down churches all over the state. And you're effectively funding it. And so what's happened is, by the same analogy here, by not producing our own energy here, and by giving funds to these regimes that are like Putin, that where we saw a 161% increase in crude oil importation under the Biden administration, by being dependent upon these regimes, now we've seen they're negotiating with Iran, with Venezuela, with Saudi Arabia. I mean, same outcome. They're pushing in this direction, overly aggressively trying to force the market in a direction of wind and solar and other technologies, which, look, I like, but you can't overly force the market when the market's not ready, because all this does is play into the hands of China, which makes 90% of the solar panels today. I want to be very clear on this. This skyrocketing of prices started on day one of this administration. This was 100% self-imposed. This was absolutely forced or unforced errors that they've committed. And now every single American is paying the price. And it's resulting in less economic activity in the United States, fewer jobs in the United States. And it's a drop in income, because when you produce natural resources, it's one of the only ways to actually produce additional revenue. So our Treasury is experiencing less revenues because of these very policies.
Let me play devil's advocate. Let me say, okay, I'll take you for what you say. And I know the price is really high. So you say it's an emergency situation. But I care about the environment. So if I care so much about the environment, if I shut down production in the United States, is that better for the environment? And I'll pay higher pricing.
So something, and a bunch of reporters here, so fact check me all you want. None of you have ever reported this. So I'll ask you a quick question. Who reduced emissions more, Trump or Biden? All right, I asked Michael Mann, who's supposed to be the top climate scientist in the nation, at a hearing the other day. He said Biden, just as most of you would probably answer. Here's the fact. Emissions went down 10.3% under President Trump, 10.3% over 4 years, an average of approximately 2.5% a year. Under President Biden, they went up 6.3% in his first year. All right? Emissions have gone up under President Biden. They went down under President Trump. Prices have gone up under President Biden. They were stable or went down under President Trump. Energy security has completely dissolved under President Biden, and it was much better under President Trump. To answer your question, look, the facts are very clear. Producing domestically, being dependent upon our own supplies, we have some of the most stringent environmental regulations, environmental policies, safety policies in the world, right here in the United States. So a comparison, if you take a cubic foot of gas and you deliver it to Europe, Russian gas is about 41% dirtier or greater emissions than U.S. gas. So the more that we supplant Vladimir Putin's gas, the better for the environment, the better for national security, the better for global peace and stability. So I can't say enough about how flawed these energy policies are. They're not based on science. They're not based on fact. Worse for the environment and worse for the American people's pocketbook.
So back in the other Congress, Waxman proposed putting these caps on emissions and others, and he had a goal of where to set. So that bill never passed, but he had these goals. Where does America look like today based upon where the Democrats want to take us?
It's a great point. There's some awesome graphs and slides on this. So here's the thing. If you look at what Waxman-Markey was trying to do, it charted a course of exactly where emissions were going to go without action, where they were going to go under their bill, and what was going to happen with energy prices, which they predicted energy prices were going to go up. In reality, what's happened is that by letting the markets do what they do, emissions have gone down beyond what Waxman-Markey was going to require, and prices are prior to this administration, energy prices were a fraction of what they were projected to be. And another example of that, President Obama had something called the Clean Power Plan, reduce emissions by 30% off a 2005 baseline by 2030. President Trump came in and said, no, we're not doing this. By letting the markets do what they do, we actually exceeded the Obama goal, not in 2030, which obviously hasn't happened yet, but in 2019. We exceeded the goal that was set by the Obama administration by letting market do what it does, by letting innovators innovate, and by not having government come in and actually structure it. So look, lesson learned. Let the markets do what they do, help to innovate, inspire innovation, and you get greater outcomes in terms of affordability, greater outcomes in terms of American economic activity and jobs, and greater performance or greater outcomes for the environment. Win, 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 win.
Okay, last question. The president was opposed to pipelines. The Democrats voted against pipelines. So in California, Gavin Newsom lowered California's production by 20%. That didn't mean we used less. We filled it somewhere else. So we had 89,000 barrels less a day in California we produced. So we filled that with 50,000 more from Russia. Now you're saying that's dirtier. We get the majority of our oil now from Ecuador. So we're still utilizing it. And the interesting part is people think that just goes into gas. That goes into your clothing, into your phones, into your ink of your print, into the asphalt. That's why and then not just transportation costs, but it raises all costs. If we can't move it by a pipeline, but it's still going to come here, what would be the safest, sound way to transport it then? I mean, is he picking this over safety or environment?
National Research Council did an analysis, and actually, I apologize, Kevin, but I got to pick on your home state for just a minute. Look, like, you can look at all this stuff. You can look at evidence at what performs and look at examples states have carried out policies and what works and what doesn't. State of California, eighth worst emissions growth in America, most dependent state on foreign energy, not just Ecuadorian oil. 50% of the Ecuadorian oil coming out of the Amazon rainforest is going to the state of California. Least reliable electricity network in the United States. I mean, which of the and double the electricity rates of my home state of Louisiana? Which of these do you want to force on the American people? National Research Council did a very extensive study looking at trucks, trains, barges, ships, and pipelines. Hands down, best for the environment is to put energy in a pipe. It is the safest for the environment, and it's the least emissions. So when the Biden administration shuts down the Keystone Pipeline, under the auspices of, oh, hey, this is because of greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions are lower going through a pipeline. And Jen Psaki the other day acknowledged it didn't have any impact on production. She acknowledged that the energy was just being transported through different ways, which means less safe and higher emissions, directly contradicting what they said their justification was for shutting down the pipeline. You can't. The policies that they're implementing on energy reflect the inexperience and candidly, and I'm sorry for saying this, just flat out stupidity of people that are making these decisions. The facts are completely in the other direction.
You know, if we take the majority, you find out that out of this task force, we could become energy independent. But we can go beyond that. We could be dominant. But what happens there is not only does the price of your gas lower, what the crude goes into all the other products cost less. So your manufacturing is a better chance here. Environment's better. It goes into your task force as well. I mean, and then the provisions there from the taxes and for the schools and others, it just makes us stronger. But then when you look from a worldwide view, it makes the world safer. So I mean, there is real opportunity here, and it's amazing to me that not one Democrat brought up a gasoline price. Not one Democrat. It's not just the leadership, but not one Democrat. So let's open it up for questions wherever you want to go. Yes.
It was reported last night that Ginny Thomas, the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, was texting and pressing then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Since then, Justice Clarence Thomas has ruled on some cases involved with January 6th, including being the lone dissenter in a ruling that allowed the Trump administration to turn over documents to the Select Committee. My question for you is, do you think Justice Thomas should recuse himself from January 6th related cases going forward?
No, I think Justice Thomas can make his decisions like he's made them every other time. It's his decision based upon law. If you spent any time studying the Supreme Court justice, he's one who studies correctly, and I mean from all the way through. If he sees it's not upholding the Constitution, he'll rule against it. If it's the Constitution, that's what his job should be. It's him.
It looks like Jim Jordan, you agree with that as well.
Totally.
You don't have to. All right, yes, sir.
Two questions, one for Mr. Jordan, one for you. Well, first to you on Fortenberry, convicted of 3 felony counts yesterday. Does he need to step aside?
That was late last night. I've got a text into him to talk to him today. I know he's in California, different time zone. I will discuss that with him today.
And Mr. Jordan, I want to ask you about judiciary priorities when it comes to tech. You mentioned 230. Could you just give us some of your other big priorities when it comes to tech regulation and things of that nature, antitrust, and what else is on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, basically what I said earlier, I do think the consumer wants to know as quickly as possible why tech might take down posts they put up. I mean, we got this situation now with Twitter's locked out the Babylon Bee now for, I think, several days. But your average consumer wants to know why and when, those kind of things. So transparency is important. The liability protection issue, Section 230, we are trying to get that language right, working closely with Kathy McMorris Rogers and her staff. Our staff on Judiciary is doing that. And then, as I said earlier, this expedited ways to try to get cases that deal directly with the antitrust issue in front of, the Trump administration had an FTC and a DOJ case, Facebook and Google, I forget which one. I think FTC was Facebook and DOJ was Google, that they had brought. So we'd like to get those in front of the Supreme Court as quickly as we can and get a ruling on this. And the justice who was just mentioned has sort of, based on what he's written, sounds like he wants to deal with this issue. And we need to get an answer for the American people. And then, of course, you hope the marketplace is moving in a direction that's going to give us more competition in the area as well.
You got to have a fair marketplace too. So you got to look at practice where people are, and you got to look at people if they're monopolies or not. Yes.
So Congressman Fortenberry is a convicted felon now. I know you said you were going to talk to him, but that doesn't change the facts that he's a convicted felon. Does he belong in Congress, and do you think he should resign?
I'm going to discuss with him today. I think he had his day in court, and I think if he wants to appeal, he can go do that as a private citizen. But I think out of respect, you can let me talk to him today. But I think when someone's convicted, it's time to resign. Yes.
Rebuilding the wall specifically, and she talked about the Dignity Act, which has more to do with immigration reform. And I'm curious, where exactly is the GOP, House GOP, on her bill, the Dignity Act? Do you support that specifically?
I haven't seen the Dignity Act. That's her individual bill yet. So, but I think everybody's united, and we have to secure the border. This border is not secure based upon this president. He's talking about removing Title 42. We are now finding people on the terrorist watch list. Not because they told us, but because Republicans went down and had conversations with the border agents themselves. These are individuals on the terrorist watch list. They now no longer will report that back to you from Yemen on different days. You now have more fentanyl in America than any given time, enough to kill all of us 7 times over. It's become more cartels are controlling these border cities. You watch schools being shut down, not one day, but like 40 days, where they're having shootouts along the way. But what's happening is with fentanyl is now the #1 killer in America for anyone by the age of 18 to 45. We just watched down here in Florida a number of kids at spring break who OD'd. 2 of them OD'd, didn't take the drug. It was cocaine laced with fentanyl, but they were giving CPR. And we're watching it throughout our entire country. This is what's happening along this border, and it's all not because any law has been changed. It's the executive orders. Now, once we secure the border, I think you have to finish the wall, but there's other actions that have to take place. Everyone understands our immigration system is broken. We need to fix that. But the first thing you have to do is secure your borders. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Leader, yesterday you mentioned that you don't just want to win the majority, you want to make sure that you get a strong governing majority. What does a governing majority mean? Is it large enough that you don't have these small margins like we've seen with the Democrats, where a lot of their own caucus members are pushing leadership to do something that leadership may not want to do? To people who are literally more focused on policy over politics and trying to get at it with their colleagues?
Look, I think a governing majority, 2 things. Yes, you want to have a large enough majority that you can govern, but more importantly, what we are doing, regardless of size, we are sitting working on the policy today, listening to the American public. It's not just today. We've been doing it for more than a year. We're coming out with solutions. If we're unified in that, even if we had a small majority, we'd be very strong to be able to pass it. So it's working together as one makes it much stronger. We don't have a rule like the Senate where you have to have 60% of the House to pass something. We understand President Biden will still be president, and the Senate will still have the 60 rule vote. So we want the idea to be so strong it could overcome all the politics that other people play. You want to touch that?
Well, the first question that Kevin got, the leader got on Wednesday, that press conference was, why are we doing the task force? Why do you have the task force organized and have an agenda? And it's because I think it's real simple. You can't do what you said if you haven't said what you'll do. And so when you actually run on a platform, here's what we care about. Here's what we're going to do because the American people care about that. That will help keep the team together and accomplishing what we told the people we were going to do when we ran for the job, and the reason they're going to put us in the majority and make Kevin Speaker. So that's why these task force coming up with those policies are so darn important. A lot of this election is going to be about how bad they are, and everyone knows how bad they are. They've screwed up everything in 14 months. You can't pick one policy area that they've done right. But they also want to know what we're going to do if, in fact, they give us power. And that is you can't do what you said if you haven't said what you'll do. That is why this is so critical.
You got to have a contrast so people make it. And I mean, the question the American voters out there saying is, can we afford it? They can't afford any of their policies, so they want to know what are our policies. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Sorry if you've been asked this already, but former President Donald Trump rescinded his endorsement of Mo Brooks. I was curious if he's still supporting him, what you make of his statement that he has said the president asked me to rescind the election of 2020.
I never endorsed in that Senate race. That's a Senate race, so yeah. I've been in a conference. I haven't read what Mo has written. So, I mean, the president has the right to endorse who he wants and pull the endorsement if he thinks the person's not doing what he said he would do. So, that's fine. Yes, ma'am.
Throughout this conference, you guys have talked about how important it is not only to win, but to govern once you are in the majority. And I'm wondering what lessons maybe you've learned or talked about with Newt Gingrich or lessons from former House speakers who, obviously won but weren't able to keep the majority for very long, and how you plan to go forward.
If you don't like the question, I'll answer.
I mean,
I'm just trying to get the others to
Yeah,
talk.
no, we
It's
can
kind of
continue.
like a different question for me. Look, I think from a lot of aspects, the philosophy I have is continual improvement. So let's improve. There's things we did when in the majority that we did really well, but I don't think we reached our potential. There's things internally that we didn't do well, and I think we've been solving those. The first thing you always want to do is listen to the American public. Identify the problem, then identify a solution. and take it to the public, but take it to the conference as well and work through it. The more that, and then you have challenges of certain things that are going to come up, right? Don't wait until that problem comes up that how do you pass appropriation bills? What do you do on a debt ceiling? How do we look in a nature that Congress has these set structures, but you don't have to keep it that way? Should you keep a budget in a 10-year window? Or should we look at 20 years and come together at one budget and hold our feet to the fire? You know, when you look at the two biggest threats long-term to America is our debt and China. Okay? So what are we going to do to solve that? Well, we've got to get our debt under control. It's driving inflation. How do we balance it? How do we pay it off? Well, if we set a budget and we stick to it year after year, well, then you also have a concern, what about our military? Okay, but you can't just keep throwing money at the military. We should be reforming the military where our dollars go further. So it's continual improvement in everything you go. We just went through a pandemic. We looked at government from a different perspective. How can government be held more accountable but provide better services? You had people who came into work or not. How do we use technology to get a better environment but actually be able to produce more that we were able to do and lower the cost? But how do we use technology to provide service to the public? Think for a moment. We've had these challenges in the VA where these veterans can't get an appointment. But America looks on their phone, picks an app and gets an Uber, rates the driver, they rate them and get everything on. Why couldn't we create technology where a veteran could go online, get their appointment, rate their doctor, and have the technology? That's why we're spending time at MIT, right? How can we use AI, artificial intelligence, to provide greater health care to individuals to know what tests they should have and when they should have it? They can give us the data back. Or quantum, right? How are we as elected officials making those decisions? How do we turn an Intel committee that just purely became political under the Democrats, that missed what happened in Afghanistan, missed what's happening in Ukraine, based upon a chairman that took his position that he got more information than others, and then lied to the American public? Well, what do we do there? We take, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we can say, if you want to serve on that committee, I've got a whole program created, a class from MIT focusing on the real concerns that we have. So we're better as a nation prepared. That's how.
Can I add one thing in there, Leader? I think one of the things that this conference has done a great job is us also identifying what the problems are that we're facing. And as we understand what the problems are, the alignment in our conference to tackle them, I think, continues to grow stronger. So we look at jobs in the economy. I think one thing that hasn't been reported enough, but I think our members understand, is how far behind the 8 ball we are. We've been under a very low interest rate environment for a long time. We've allowed the federal government to drive the national debt up to $30 trillion. Inflation has reared its ugly head. The Federal Reserve is indicating that they're going to move interest rates up. 1% in interest rates on $30 trillion in debt, rough math, is $300 billion. If they move interest rates up to a level where inflation was last at this level, think of it as 3, 4, 5%. Every 1% is $300 billion of impact on the budget. You can get in the weeds as to exactly how those numbers play out over time, how much of that's cash flow, how much of that plays out later. Fine. But it's hundreds of billions of dollars. We're already significantly behind the 8 ball. If the interest rate moves up, we could be in a situation, and our members understand the challenge that we're facing. And I think these task forces, jobs in the economy in particular, where I serve with Patrick McHenry, does a good job of making sure the members understand the challenge that we face today could even be worse by the time we're finally able to remove one-party control. And I think that's one of the strengths of having these task forces and the strength of having this conference.
Just very quickly, look, part of the wisdom behind what the Republican leaders doing here is that the House, look, you all know that the characteristics of the House is one that's kind of dealing with the flash fire of the day, right? And in a very chaotic environment, oftentimes in dealing with whatever the issue du jour is. Some of the problems that we're talking about, things like balancing the budget and getting the economy in a growth trajectory, these are things that people have been trying to deal with for decades and decades. And look, no one's gotten it perfect. So now, instead of us getting there and saying, okay, we're the dog who caught the bumper, what are we going to do now? Let's spend months and be very thoughtful about this. Let's make sure we don't go say these things like we're going to ban oil and gas and then try and figure out how to back into the ridiculous commitment that you made. we've got to be thoughtful, got to be strategic, learn from, yes, the wisdom and the trials and errors of Newt Gingrich, but also from this administration, learning from the mistakes, and hopefully we can pick up from successes if they have any. We can learn from those as well and build on those. But it's very important that we take the time to do this now, to make sure that we get it right, to make sure that we're communicating with the American public and getting their feedback and learning their priorities, to where when we take the majority in January, we hit the ground running and actually implementing solutions.
And it's kind of what Brian said. If we're successful in winning the majority because of this party rule, when they hand it over to us, and there's going to be fewer options. So you should talk about those problems now. I'll give you one example of where we learned from. The Democrats win the majority once they won Georgia. They're in the majority in the House, and they had a schedule set for Congress. You know, the first thing they did was recess because they had no idea what to do. And then when you look at their bill, they're flying the airplane, and then they're trying to work on it at the same time. I'll get closer to it. All right, yes, ma'am. You had a question. Look, I've talked for a long time about the challenges with China. I tried to get Nancy Pelosi for us to do this together. The Washington Post even wrote a story about it, then she backed away, making an even number of Republicans and Democrats at the time. That's why we created the task force on China. You know, China's gone out and captured different industries where they control. That's where we have a supply chain problem as well, from critical minerals. If you want to buy solar panels and others. I mean, they systematically planned and went after these. We can't sit back and allow that to happen, especially for national security or even for our economies in the future. And so that task force, or that becomes, if it became a select committee, would identify those areas, identify those industries, and advise the Congress of where we need to make our investments, where we need to fight back in the process. I don't know who you're talking to because I haven't made any decision there. It's probably somebody who wants to be in leadership. Yes, ma'am. I'll go here and right behind. We'll go right through, yeah.
I'll touch on the energy and then let Brian address the rest of it. But on the energy front, well, actually, let me hit China very briefly. The previous administration is the one that, for the first time, really brought up the China issue and I think confronted it and said this is a massive problem that has evolved over decades and we're going to address it. So I think you have to commend them for identifying the issue, for beginning to hit it head on. Are we done? No, absolutely not. Leader McCarthy just touched on some of the rare earth critical minerals and other strategic things they've done to further, I think, exert leverage over the United States. Specifically on energy issues related to conventional energy sources, I made note earlier. This administration further enriched the Putin regime and effectively created an environment where they could afford to put away, what was it, $630 billion in order to allow them the reserves to withstand the sanctions that they anticipated. We propped them up. Look, the last time that Putin invaded Ukraine was when the Obama administration had similarly increased our dependence upon Russian energy. Putin knew he had leverage over the United States. So Biden came in and effectively committed the same mistake once again with Europe and the United States more dependent on Russian energy. He knew he had leverage. And look at what's happening with prices in the United States, with prices in Europe. So no, absolutely, this administration has not done enough. But I do think you have to give commendations where due in the previous administration on China and identifying and confronting the issue.
I think as we look at the financial sanctions, I think we've seen steps in the right direction. The Financial Services Committee, we held a hearing a couple days ago on a series of additional sanctions that we could put in place. There are additional tools in the toolkit. But the gorilla in the room is that our Western allies in Europe are sending hundreds of millions of dollars a day for Russian oil and natural gas. And so there's going to be a whole process to decouple Western Europe. I think Mr. Graves spoke eloquently on that topic. As it relates to China, I think what we're seeing in particular is a lot of business leaders globally reanalyzing the geopolitical risk that I think many failed to calculate appropriately in making decisions to exit the United States and their production. And I think a lot of boardrooms and business leaders are reanalyzing that today. And my hope is that many of them make the decision that the United States is the right place to place their production. And so if we go back previously, if we go back 10, 15, 20 years, many business leaders in the United States made, in my opinion, the wrong decision to exit the United States for a location of production. They're now realizing the geopolitical risk they put themselves in. And this is an opportunity for us to get the policies right so that the tax code and other policies are encouraging production here in the United States rather than the policies we're seeing being put forward by the left today. Think of Build Back Better, that increases the cost of production here in the United States, a Made in America tax. We need to be doing the opposite. So as these job creators are making decisions of where to locate production, in particular locate production in China or in the United States, if we align the policies with what they're seeing playing out, we have an opportunity to really onshore a lot of production that we allowed to leave the United States previously.
And if you're trying to make that decision today, there's two main factors you look at if you want to domicile somewhere. Tax code, we did pretty well, got that right. But what you're really going to look at, what are the energy costs and what are the labor costs? Mm-hmm. Labor, we have a hard time competing with other countries in. But before we had a lower energy cost. Now, based upon what this one-party rule, they have just made us less competitive. That's the difficulty. Yes, sir, you had a question.
I'd take one note on that I think is important is when we saw that initial report that said that the revenue is going to be increased dramatically by forcing Americans to report net inflow outflows out of bank accounts up to $10,000, those numbers moved around. The Treasury Department was never able to show how they got to that revenue projection. Congressman French Hill and I have sent letters and continued to request for this information. And so I think there's a lot of questions as to where are they generating those revenue projections exactly by actually having the information on U.S. and Americans' bank accounts? I think that's an important question that still needs to be answered.
I would just add one thing. When they were talking about, the IRS was talking about, monitoring every transaction over a certain amount, I got a call from bankers and credit unions folks in our district, in the 4th District of Ohio. And I thought they were going to tell me, oh, we don't want to, this is terrible because of the hassle and the cost of doing business to monitor this and do that. I thought they were going to come at it from that angle. They didn't. They came at it from a purely liberty focus. They said, our members, our customers, our clients, this is wrong for freedom. It was totally on the freedom issue. And I think, again, one of the reasons Kevin put this task force together on the freedom is issues like this as well. And you saw what you saw the decision from the SEC earlier this week when what they're trying to make companies do and where they have to invest. This is scary road that the left wants to take us down, and people get it across the board.
You guys have been pretty clear, but you don't like that. I want to know what you guys think about to solve the problem on your side. What ideas do you have to bring to get the tax gap closed?
Number one way to close the tax gap, get more people working. This is a real contrast in elections, and this is a fundamental contrast. Why do you think the IRS there is just to go audit people? Why shouldn't there be IRS there to help people? Why do you think you need to know as a government what people do for $600 or more? No, I don't think that brings more revenue to the government. I think that's greater control of the government. I think that stymies economic growth. And it's not what I think, it's what's been proven. When you watched what our tax reform did, even during a pandemic, brought more revenue into the coffers and into the states as well. So when more people work, when there's less restrictions, more people can work, more people can buy a house, more people can send their kids to school, instead of government looking over everything you're doing, every single transaction, and hire more people in the IRS just to come after and audit you. I think that fundamentally goes against what America believes. I believe Americans are good. I'd rather help them in their tax reforms instead of hire more people just to audit and believe you're wrong. I've always loved the professors that we've all had them in the day that would only want to put a red mark on your paper and tell you where you're wrong. I didn't learn much for them. But those that excelled and taught me how to improve in the process, I reached new potentials. That's just a fundamental philosophy difference of what we have. And I don't believe if the Democrats did that, they would get any more money. I think they'd get less because they'd have less economic activity because more people be afraid of what government's doing. Hey, thank you all very much. We appreciate you coming to the retreat.